In an Egyptian tomb sealed more than 3,000 years ago, archaeologists found small clay jars packed carefully among the burial goods. Inside was honey. It had never been opened, never been touched by air or insects or time. And when researchers finally broke the seal, the honey inside was still soft, still golden, still perfectly edible. No refrigeration, no preservatives, just a jar and 30 centuries of silence. That alone would make honey remarkable. But the stranger part of its story is this. For most of human history, honey was not simply something you ate. It was something you paid with. In parts of medieval Russia and Eastern Europe, entire tax systems ran on it. Peasants paid their rent in honey. Kings collected tribute in honey. Fines for crimes were settled in honey. A single healthy beehive could be worth more than a cow, and a forest full of wild bee trees could make a family wealthy for generations. Long before coins jingled in anyone's pocket, sticky jars of honey and blocks of beeswax were doing the work that money does today. This is the story of how that happened. And it starts not with humans at all, but with an insect that never asked to become a currency. Roughly 8,000 years ago, on the eastern coast of what is now Spain, a group of hunter-gatherers left behind a message on the wall of a rock shelter near Valencia. It shows a human figure clinging to ropes, scaling a sheer cliff face, reaching into a crack in the rock where a wild colony of bees had built its hive. Around the climber, painted bees swirl in agitation. It is the oldest known depiction of honey hunting anywhere on Earth, and it captures something essential about humanity's earliest relationship with bees. This was not farming. This was not domestication. This was a raid. Wild honeybees do not build hives to be harvested. They build them to survive, packing wax combs with enough stored food to outlast a winter with no flowers at all. A colony that loses its honey can starve. So when early humans climbed cliffs and forced their way into hollow trees to take that honey, they were stealing from an animal that would sting, swarm, and sometimes kill in its own defense. Smoke became the first technology of the honey trade. Hunters learned that thick smoke blown into a hive disrupted the bees' alarm signals and triggered a survival instinct, gorging on honey in case they needed to flee, which left them calmer and less likely to attack. It was a discovery that would still be in use, almost unchanged, 6,000 years later. Somewhere around 2,400 years before the Common Era, in the temples of ancient Egypt, honey hunting became honey keeping. Stone reliefs carved into the walls of the Sun Temple of Niuser show rows of cylindrical clay hives stacked along riverbanks, with workers using smoke pots to calm the bees inside before extracting the combs. This was not casual foraging anymore. It was organized production, tied directly to the machinery of the state. Egyptian honey was offered to the gods in temple rituals. It was used in the embalming process to help preserve the bodies of the dead. It was even used as a form of payment, with laborers on royal building projects sometimes receiving jars of honey as part of their wages, alongside bread and beer. The pharaoh himself carried the title Bee King as part of his royal titulature, a symbol tying the health of the hive to the health of the state. In Egypt, honey was already doing something remarkable. It was becoming a form of value that could move through an economy the same way grain or metal did. That value did not stay contained to Egypt for long. As trade networks expanded across the ancient Mediterranean, honey spread with them, absorbed into the economies of the Minoans, the Greeks, and eventually Rome. On the slopes of Mount Hymettus, near Athens, wild thyme blossomed across the hillsides every summer, and the honey produced there became one of the most prized exports in the ancient Greek world, prized enough that philosophers wrote about it directly. Aristotle devoted careful attention to bee behavior in his work on the natural history of animals, describing hive structure, worker roles, and swarming with an accuracy that would not be meaningfully improved upon for nearly 2,000 years. Rome inherited this fascination and turned honey into a fixture of elite life. It sweetened wine into a drink called mulsum. It preserved fruit long before sugar was widely available in Europe. It served as medicine, rubbed into wounds and mixed into remedies for coughs and stomach ailments. But for centuries, large-scale beekeeping remained a specialized, almost aristocratic pursuit, a controlled and cultivated craft rather than something every household could practice. Egypt and the Mediterranean were not the only ancient civilizations building an economy around bees. Thousands of miles away, in the tropical lowlands of the Yucatan Peninsula, the Maya had domesticated an entirely different kind of bee altogether, a small, stingless species known as Melipona. Without the defensive weapon that made European and African honeybees so dangerous to raid, Melipona hives could be kept close to the home, housed in hollowed-out logs, stacked horizontally, and sealed with mud and stone discs at either end. Maya beekeepers, particularly across the region around Xunantunich and throughout the wider Yucatan, treated these bees as something close to sacred. Honey from Melipona hives was used in religious ceremonies, offered to gods associated with fertility and rain, and fermented into a ritual drink called balke, made by soaking tree bark in honey water. The bee itself carried spiritual weight, associated with the god Ah Muzen Cab, often depicted in Maya codices as a descending, winged figure. When Spanish colonization swept through the region centuries later, European honeybees were introduced alongside colonial agriculture, and the more aggressive, higher-yielding European hives gradually displaced much of the traditional Melipona keeping. Today, conservationists and indigenous beekeepers across the Yucatan are working to revive Melipona cultivation, protecting a bee and a beekeeping tradition that predates European contact by well over 1,000 years. And just as with grain and gold in other corners of history, wherever something becomes valuable, superstition tends to follow close behind. Honey collected its own layer of folklore and unease over the centuries, the same way an unfamiliar root vegetable would, centuries later, in the fields of Europe. In parts of medieval Europe, honey that tasted unusually dark, bitter, or strong was sometimes blamed on bees that had fed near graveyards or on so-called corpse blooms, flowers believed to carry a trace of death into whatever fed on them. Beekeeping itself became wrapped in ritual and superstition. Across England, Germany, and parts of rural America, a custom known as telling the bees took hold, in which a death in the family had to be formally announced to the household hives, often accompanied by a small piece of black cloth draped over the boxes. Failing to inform the bees, tradition held could cause them to sicken, swarm away, or stop producing honey altogether, as though the insects themselves were mourners who deserved to be kept informed. Mead, honey's fermented cousin, and very likely one of humanity's oldest alcoholic drinks, carried its own suspicion. In many parts of early medieval Europe, mead was closely tied to Norse and Slavic ritual feasting. Poured out in halls dedicated to gods, the church was actively trying to displace. Norse sagas describe mead halls as sacred gathering places, where warriors drank from horns filled with fermented honey, while skalds recited tales of gods and ancestors. And later, Viking-age burial sites across Scandinavia have turned up traces of honey-based drinks buried alongside the dead, suggesting mead was thought necessary even in the afterlife. As Christianity expanded across the continent, mead's pagan associations made it a target of quiet disapproval, while wine, tied to Mediterranean Christian tradition, was elevated instead. And just as bread outranked the potato on European tables centuries later, honey itself split cleanly along class lines. Pale, delicate, carefully strained honey was reserved for nobility and church use. Darker, stronger, less refined honey, the kind produced by ordinary rural beekeepers, was looked down upon as coarse and unrefined. A peasant's sweetener rather than a noble one. It took deliberate political effort to turn honey from a folk resource into a pillar of state power. And the man most responsible for that shift in Western Europe was an emperor rather than a peasant. Around the year 800, Charlemagne issued a sweeping administrative document known as the Capitulare de Villis, a detailed set of instructions for how royal estates across his empire were to be managed. Buried among instructions about orchards, livestock, and grain stores was a direct requirement that every estate maintain beekeepers and report their honey and wax yields to the crown. Beekeeping, almost overnight, became a matter of imperial bookkeeping rather than private hobby. Further east, in the forming states of Kievan Rus, honey and beeswax became something even more fundamental, a recognized form of tribute paid directly to princes and the church, alongside furs and grain. Beeswax carried its own enormous value, quite separate from the honey itself, because every candle burned in every church, monastery, and noble household across medieval Europe depended on it. In an age before electric light, beeswax candles were considered pure enough for sacred use, while cheaper tallow candles, made from animal fat, produced smoke and a smell considered unfit for holy spaces. This made bees a strange kind of dual currency machine, producing both a sweetener valuable enough to pay taxes with and a wax valuable enough to light every church in Christendom. Nowhere was this taken more seriously than in medieval Poland and Lithuania, where an entire specialized profession emerged around forest beekeeping. These foresters, known as bartnicy, held legally protected rights to specific hollow trees deep in the woodland, passed down through families like inherited property. Honey theft in these regions was treated as a serious crime, punishable under detailed legal codes that specified exact penalties depending on how much honey was stolen and from whose tree. An entire branch of medieval law existed simply to protect the property rights of bees. But an economy built this deeply around a single living creature carries a hidden fragility, and honey's history carried the same warning sign that would later doom an entire nation's dependence on the potato. As monasteries, tax collectors, and trade routes across Europe and Russia grew structurally reliant on seasonal honey and wax yields, the system assumed something that nature could not always guarantee: healthy, disease-free colonies and a stable, predictable blooming season. A harsh winter, a poor wildflower bloom, or an outbreak of disease within local hives could collapse an entire region's honey economy almost overnight, with no alternative currency waiting in reserve. For centuries, the system held. The bees kept producing, the tribute kept flowing, and nobody thought too hard about what would happen if the hives themselves ever failed on a larger scale. That question would not be answered for another 1,000 years. And when the answer finally came, it would not arrive through medieval taxation records. It would arrive as a modern, unexplained catastrophe. In the middle of the 2000s, beekeepers across the United States and parts of Europe began reporting something that looked less like a disease and more like a disappearance. Healthy-looking hives, full of honey, full of brood, full of a living queen, were simply being abandoned. Worker bees left en masse and never returned, leaving behind exactly the kind of colony that should have thrived. Researchers gave the phenomenon a name: colony collapse disorder, and the scale of it was staggering. In the worst affected seasons, some commercial beekeepers reported losing between 30 and 90% of their colonies in a single year. Entire operations that had supported families for generations were wiped out within a matter of months. The panic reached far beyond honey producers themselves, because honeybees do far more than make honey. Roughly 1 in every 3 bites of food eaten by humans depends, directly or indirectly, on pollination performed largely by honeybees, from almonds and apples to a long list of fruits and vegetables that quietly rely on this one insect's labor. A honeybee crisis was not simply a honey shortage, it was a threat to entire branches of global agriculture. Researchers pointed to a tangle of contributing causes rather than a single villain. Exposure to certain pesticides known as neonicotinoids that appeared to disrupt bee navigation and immune function, parasitic varroa mites that weakened colonies from within, habitat loss as wildflower meadows gave way to monoculture farmland, and the nutritional stress of bees forced to forage across vast stretches of a single crop rather than a varied natural landscape. It was, in many ways, a modern and human-made version of the same fragility that had been quietly built into the honey economy for 1,000 years, a system that had never fully diversified against catastrophe finally meeting one. Colony collapse was not honey's only modern crisis. Around the same period, investigators in the United States, Europe, and Asia uncovered a second, quieter threat, one built entirely by humans rather than mites or pesticides. Testing labs began finding that a significant share of honey sold on store shelves worldwide had been diluted with cheap sugar syrups, often made from rice or corn, and blended in such small increments that it could pass casual inspection while still being sold under a pure honey label. Journalists and food safety regulators began calling the practice honey laundering, tracing shipments that moved through multiple countries specifically to disguise their true origin and avoid tariffs or purity testing. For genuine beekeepers already struggling with collapsing colonies, the flood of cheap, adulterated honey undercut prices and made an already fragile trade even harder to sustain. The scandal pushed several countries to invest in more advanced pollen and isotope testing designed to catch the fraud, turning honey purity into a genuine, ongoing international enforcement effort. The response, much like the response to the Irish potato blight generations earlier, was not retreat, but reinvention. Governments, universities, and beekeeping cooperatives around the world launched coordinated research into bee health, breeding programs aimed at disease and mite-resistant colonies, and large-scale efforts to restore diverse flowering habitat that bees could forage across, rather than a single monotonous crop. Entire nations doubled down on beekeeping as both an economic strategy and an ecological one. China scaled both traditional and modern apiculture to become the largest honey producer on Earth. New Zealand transformed a regional wildflower, Manuka, into one of the most valuable honey exports in the world, a product prized for its distinctive antibacterial properties and now used in hospitals for medical-grade wound care, a strange and fitting echo of honey's ancient role as medicine in the temples of Egypt. In Ethiopia, one of Africa's largest honey-producing nations, traditional beekeeping remains deeply woven into rural economic life, supporting millions of households, much the way it once supported medieval Slavic villages. And in cities from New York to London to Paris, a wave of urban beekeeping took hold. Rooftop hives installed on office buildings and apartment blocks as a small but meaningful act of both food security and pollinator conservation. The lesson, in the end, mirrored exactly what the potato taught the world after Ireland's catastrophe. Never let an entire system depend on a single fragile point of failure. Diversify the genetics, diversify the habitat, diversify the supply chain. Spread the risk across the whole planet rather than a single hive. Honey today has grown far beyond the jar on a kitchen shelf. Global production now exceeds 1.8 million metric tons every year, moving through economies on a scale the ancient Egyptians could never have imagined. Beyond food, honey shows up in cosmetics, in skincare, and in modern medical dressings, designed specifically around its natural antibacterial properties. Beeswax, honey's quieter industrial partner, still appears in candles, in cosmetics, in food glazing, and even in surfboard wax and specialized lubricants, a modern descendant of the same substance that once lit every candle in medieval Christendom. Mead, all but forgotten for centuries, has surged back into popularity as part of the modern craft beverage movement, humanity's oldest alcoholic drink, finding new life among 21st century drinkers, rediscovering it as something ancient and unfamiliar at the same time. And the honeybee's importance now reaches well past agriculture entirely. Scientists studying the extraordinary coordination of a hive, thousands of individual insects functioning almost like a single organism, have drawn directly on that behavior to inform swarm logic algorithms and robotics research. An insect that once symbolized royal tribute, now quietly shaping the software behind coordinated robotic systems. Consider, for a moment, the full arc of that story. A wild, defended, and dangerous insect colony raided at enormous personal risk on a cliffside in ancient Spain. A substance so valuable that entire kingdoms built their tax codes around it, and forests were guarded under criminal law to protect it. A folk creature wrapped in enough superstition to be blamed for graveyard flowers and mourned like a member of the family. An economy nearly brought to its knees by a mysterious modern collapse that scientists are still working to fully understand. And now, a species so essential to global food production that roughly 1 in 3 bites humans eat depends on its quiet, tireless labor. The same insect that medieval tax collectors once counted more carefully than coins is still, right now, doing the work that keeps much of the modern world fed. Not bad for a creature nobody ever really controlled, and one still capable of collapsing an entire tax code, an entire harvest, or an entire global supply chain the moment humans forget how fragile that small, buzzing economy truly is. If you enjoyed this, hit subscribe and drop a comment telling us which part of honey's history surprised you the most. And make sure to like this video so more people can find it too.